Hello and welcome to another video by AIA Contract Documents. Today we're going to be talking about allowances in construction contracts. We are your hosts, Mike Koger and Jimmy Germano. We are both staff attorneys at the AIA working in the Contract Documents program. Before we get into the substance, it's important to note that although we are attorneys, we cannot provide legal advice, and nothing that we say here today should be confused as legal advice, and the best thing that you can do is seek appropriate legal counsel, as they'll be able to advise you on the specific particulars and facts and circumstances at issue. And for more information on the disclaimer, you can read the disclaimer that's on your screen right now. And with that, I will turn it over to Mr. Mike Koger to talk a little bit about allowances.
All right, thank you, Jimmy. So an allowance is an amount of money included in a fixed price or guaranteed maximum price contract that is allocated to an item of work when final decisions or selections about that item have not yet been made. So allowances are commonly used for finished materials and equipment, typically things like flooring, carpet, paint, cabinetry, appliances. They can also be used for things like plumbing fixtures or door hardware. And the benefit really of using an allowance for pricing on those type of items is that the owner and the contractor can enter into a contract with some degree of price certainty while giving the owner the flexibility to delay making certain decisions about the project. So taking carpet as an example, another way to think of an allowance for carpet is that the owner has prepaid for a certain amount of carpet but hasn't actually selected the specific type of carpet to go into the project yet. And those are the kinds of decisions that can be fairly easily delayed towards the end of the project, well after the construction contract has been executed by the owner and contractor. Section 3.8 of the A201 General Conditions of the Contract for Construction is where we find the allowance language in our AIA contracts. Under this section, the contractor is required to include in the contract sum all allowances stated in the contract documents. And the owner is given the ability to direct how that allowance money is spent, but the contractor has the right to refuse to employ persons or companies if they have a reasonable objection to them. So section 3.8.2 is where we find the language for how allowance money is spent and accounted for in the contract. The main idea here is that the contractor should include in its original contract sum the work that is knowable at that time, while also setting aside required allowance money for selections that will be made later. So subsection 1 of this section states that allowance money can be used for materials and equipment delivered to the site and to pay all required taxes. But subsection 2 makes it clear that costs for things like unloading, handling, labor, installation, overhead, and profit should all be included in the original contract sum. And again, the rationale here is that these are costs that should be known at the time of contracting, so they should be included in that original contract sum. So continuing on with the earlier example of carpet, if there is an allowance for carpet in the owner-contractor agreement, while the exact cost of the carpet itself might not be known at the time of contracting, all of the appurtenant costs, like those things I just mentioned, installation, labor, overhead, profit, they would all be known and should be included in that original contract sum. Then the allowance money, when it is selections are made, are just spent on costs of materials and equipment itself, along with delivery and taxes. So anytime you are dealing with allowances, it's nearly inevitable that actual costs are going to be different than the allowance amount. So subsection 3 of section 382 simply requires that those differences be accounted for by a change order when they occur. And I should also note that as much as possible, allowance amounts should be a reasonable forecast of actual costs. That way, when it does come time for the owner to make selections about allowance items, there's an adequate amount of money in the allowance amount to cover those items. If you're an owner, the last thing that you want is to have a couple of $1,000s in an allowance for that carpet, but realistically you can't provide, the contractor cannot actually provide that amount of carpet for that amount of money, and therefore the owner would have to spend a significant amount of more money in a change order. So with that, Jimmy, do you have any questions or thoughts you'd like to add?
I actually do. I have a question. So can you explain just briefly how allowances are different than contingencies? I know sometimes there's confusion between those two terms.
Absolutely. This question comes up a lot at our office when folks call in and ask us questions. So allowances and contingencies definitely have some similarities. They do differ in that a contractor's contingency is money that is allocated generally towards some unknown costs that can arise on a project, but an allowance is an amount of money that's set aside for a particular item, like cabinetry, casework, carpeting. It's just that the specifics have not yet been determined. So both are kind of pools of money that can be drawn down or can be used, but allowances are really only supposed to be used for the particular items that they are intended to cover.
Gotcha. Okay, thanks. That makes a lot of sense. So right now, I mean, today's date is May 1st, 2020, right? So we're in the middle of the COVID pandemic. So can allowances be used to deal with uncertainty caused by COVID or kind of just like general economic uncertainty? Are allowances a good strategy during those times?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's something we did cover in a much longer video about negotiating construction contracts in the COVID-19 era. So if you want to take a look at, folks who are listening to this and you want to know more about strategies to deal with COVID-19 uncertainty, go look for that longer video. It's about a half an hour long. But you're absolutely right. The current pandemic has caused a lot of unpredictable pricing and availability in a number of construction materials and equipment. So given that, if prices for an item are cheaper now than in normal times, which is possible, the owner and contractor should probably be thinking about making selections early and procuring items early if they can get a good price. But if prices are higher or if they're unpredictable right now, and there's a potential for those prices to normalize over time, particularly on the kinds of finished materials and appliances or equipment that can come later in the project, or you can potentially delay making decisions on those items, it could make sense to use allowances to allow those prices to stabilize over time if you can wait to make those decisions for, say, 6 months or so.
Gotcha. Gotcha. That makes a whole lot of sense. Thanks.
Okay. So with that, that is all we're going to talk about allowances. If you have any other questions for us, or if you'd like to learn more about AIA contract documents, please go to our AIAcontracts.org webpage. We also have a tab called Learn where you can learn more and find other videos like this. You can also reach out to us at our docinfo information line and email address, which is on the screen right now, docinfo@aiacontracts.org. Thank you very much.